The silence in the medieval chamber weighed differently. A cold promise that crept along your spine even before the flickering candle sputtered its first shadow. You found yourself swallowed by the raw stone walls, their dampness seeping through the thin fabric of your nightclothes, threadbare and failing to shield you from the chill. The air tasted of centuries-old smoke and a stubborn mold that clung like an unwelcome ghost. Your fingers brushed against a stiff weave of straw beneath you, a bed so far from the fluffy pillows of today's standards, it might as well have been a torture device. Imagine how frantic you get over a dead phone battery now. Multiply that by 100 when your only warmth sat on the verge of turning to ash in the hearth. Outside, there was a chorus of sleepy curses, the lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the curtain of fog, the slow scrape of a woodcutter's blade sharpening against stone, counting down an unkind march towards dawn. Inside, a servant's rhythmic tearing at flax echoed low and steady, weaving a soundtrack of restless industry into the night. Perhaps you had rubbed a fragment of dried lavender against your pillow, hoping its faint scent could chase off more than just the mildew. Peppermint sprigs hung overhead, rare and precious, straining to form a barrier against the unseen. Nightmares, evil spirits whispered by superstitious minds, hungry for hope amidst the dark. Your lips murmured prayers, lines repeated enough times to become a lullaby, if only to trick your mind into stillness. By candlelight, shadows danced and stretched, wrapping the narrow room in secret whispers. You caught the slight hitch of your breath as the creak from wooden beams above punctuated the silence, a sound that felt both ordinary and portentous. That quiet was the kind that made you listen for things that might never come. There was a fragile warmth shared momentarily between neighbors gathered around the meager fire, a brief spark of humanity in a world hardened by endless nights and weariness. But even that comfort was fleeting. The chill of low barks of dogs all ceased as if swallowed by the gathering dark. Through the small, grimy window, you noticed two figures exchanging a glance, eyes sharp and loaded with unsaid warnings. Something had shifted in the air, unseen but felt, a silent tremor of dread threading through the manor's ancient bones. Before the shadows could deepen further, take a breath and, hey, before Morpheus fully claims you, do a quick check to make sure you're still subscribed. For some, the button has vanished, and I don't want you missing out on the next sleepy histories. While you're at it, leave a like as soft as your pillow. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Your interaction keeps this cozy corner alive. Thanks for being part of it. The two figures outside exchanged another quick glance, their eyes narrowing beneath heavy brows. You caught the faintest tension in the air just before the edge of night began to dissolve into early dawn. The manor, usually humming with the gentle breath of life, creaking floorboards, distant chatter, the soft shuffle of footsteps seemed to hold its breath itself, waiting. Inside, your fingers tightened around the rough straw mattress. The little warmth from the dying fire no longer comforted, but reminded you of its fragility, like a flickering heartbeat resisting extinction. Above, the wooden beams groaned under the invisible weight of the cold, a slow, mournful sound that whispered secrets of winters long past. Your eyes adjusted to the candlelight, tracing the dance of shadows along the stone walls. If the walls could talk, you thought wryly, they'd probably complain more than the servants do about sleepless nights. You wondered if they had ever borne witness to something as quietly unsettling as what you sensed now. The room smelled of damp earth and the faint, bitter trace of burned wood, the hearth's reluctant breath in the cold. Your fingers brushed over the stiff linen of your nightclothes, threadbare patches glowing pale under the candle's trembling flame. Compared to the modern world's soft sheets and warm rooms, your current quarters seemed less a haven and more a test of endurance, a cold game where losing meant more than discomfort. Outside the window, the fog began to thicken, swallowing shapes and softening sounds until all that remained was a muted gray hush. Then came a faint shuffle, almost inaudible, like a secret footsteps moving cautiously through fallen leaves. Your breath caught, or maybe it was the candle flickering again, threatening to die, but your heart told you it was neither the fire nor your imagination. The two figures beyond the manor's walls were still there, their forms etched against the mist like carved statues. One cast a wary glance toward the horizon, the other's hand hovered near the pommel of what you could only guess was a knife or short sword, hinting at a readiness born from some deeper fear. You shifted on the straw, the rough texture scraping against your skin, a sudden reminder that your body was as vulnerable as your mind. Back then, a simple cut could spiral into a deadly infection. No antiseptics, no antibiotics, only whispered prayers and the mercy of an unpredictable healer. Your modern worries over emails or traffic felt absurdly trivial by comparison. A soft murmur stirred from the corridor beyond your chamber door. The familiar scrape of a wooden chair pulled across stone, followed by a hushed conversation, too low to catch, but heavy with purpose. You strained, but the voices melted into the greater silence as the candle guttered again, shrinking shadows into tight clusters near the wall. Someone pushed open the door just a crack, letting in a shard of cold air that seemed to swallow the candle's warmth for a heartbeat. A silhouette lingered, a servant perhaps, or a guard, before retreating quietly, leaving you alone with the weight of the unseen tension settling like dust. You exhaled slowly, though your chest still felt tight, a silent warning rolling across your skin. The manor wasn't merely old stone and faded tapestries. It was a crossroads for whispered fears and ancient grudges, sheltering stories written in silence and shadow. In that fragile solitude, your mind wandered to the sprigs of peppermint hung above your head. Those rare bits of green against the stone coldness were like small acts of rebellion against the inevitable decay. You fingered one softly, its faint aroma, a flicker of life amid the heavy air, promising a defense against more than just nightmares. Outside, the world remained still. Even the usual chorus of owls and rustling leaves had fallen mute, as though the night held tighter than before. You glanced toward the window again. The figures had vanished, but the charge in the air hadn't. Something had moved beneath the surface, a quiet step taken in darkness. For a moment, the quiet seemed absolute, endless. You could hear only your own breath, a heartbeat in your ears, and the fragile candle fighting against the night's engulfing silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, a faint sound reached you, a low, rhythmic tapping, distant and deliberate. It might have been a branch scraping against stone, or the slow, cautious knock of someone testing a door. Whatever it was, it offered a break in the stillness, a pulse in the frozen beat of the manor's heart. You settled back against the uneven wall, the cold seeping in again, but this time tempered by a new awareness. The night was no longer just a barrier between now and dawn, but a threshold, something waiting, watching, patient. The candles flickered one last time before steadying, shadows balancing delicately between light and dark. Yet you knew the peace was only a fragile veil over deeper stirrings. Outside, the manor's ancient stones seemed to breathe, exhaling secrets you were only beginning to understand. A whisper of cloth, a hurried step through a distant hall. The manor was waking in ways you could neither see. You weren't fully sense of the night. A soft creak answered the tapping, a sound too deliberate, too measured to be mere chance. Your fingers clenched the sheet. You were no longer just a visitor here. You were part of the silent story writing itself into these shadows. And somewhere, just beyond sight, something moved, watching. The faint tapping grew, steady and deliberate, a quiet insistence threading through the manor's heavy silence. It was not the random scrape of a stray branch or careless animal. This was something else, deliberate and waiting. You felt it vibrate faintly through the floorboards, as though the very walls were breathing in tandem with the unseen visitor's cautious approach. Your eyes traced the shadows cast by the flickering candle, watching them bend and recoil from the cold drafts, then rushing in through cracked window panes. Each breath you drew tasted of damp stone and the ever-present ache of chill. The modest fire no longer offered comfort, but served as a fragile heartbeat in the suffocating dark. You swallowed hard, the rasping scrape of your own throat a stark reminder that this was no place for weakness. Outside, the fog thickened further, blotting out all but the nearest outlines. The murmur of the world had all but vanished. No dogs, no distant cries, just a ghostly hush, wrapping the manor in suffocating stillness. Even the stars seemed to shudder behind the haze, shadows cutting deeper into every corner. You felt suddenly exposed, a lone figure in a stone cage built to endure centuries, yet vulnerable to an unseen pulse threading beneath it all. Somewhere beyond the door, the muffled sound of footsteps crept nearer, slow, irregular, carrying the weight of someone intent on secrecy. A shadow slipped beneath the door's crack, a whisper of cloth stirring the stale air. You shifted, your skin prickling as if cold fingers were tracing the small of your back. The straw beneath your fingers felt rough against skin already chilled to the bone, its coarse fibers grounding you in the immediate, tangible reality of your predicament. A soft voice murmured, so low it almost fell beneath the tapping. Words exchanged too quickly for you to catch, but suffused with urgency. A current thrumming beneath the stillness, like hidden waters ready to surge. You leaned closer to the door, every sense quivering to seize meaning from silence. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps withdrew, leaving a ringing emptiness in their wake. The candle flickered violently, sending grotesque shadows skittering along the stone. Your heartbeat surged, rehearsing rhythms learned in desperation rather than peace. You pressed your palm to the cold wall, feeling the rough irregularities of mortar and stone. If these walls could speak, would they whisper warnings or secrets? You imagined centuries of eyes, guards, and servants having dwelled in these narrow rooms, each night layering stories into the very fabric of shadow and dust. The sprigs of peppermint above your head stirred as though breathing with you, their faint scent, a sharp counterpoint to the dankness, a stubborn green spark in the crushing gray. You tried to breathe it deeper into your lungs, as if it could inoculate you against the unease crawling beneath your skin. Outside again, the night seemed held in a tight coil, the manor's bones creaking faintly in the cold, the weary groans of a house remembering storms long past. A distant church bell tolled once, hollow and mournful, then sank back into silence, leaving the manor suspended in its own fragile bubble of frost and shadow. You let your gaze drift back to the window, trying to push past the grime and fog to see into the deeper dark. There, just beyond the reach of candlelight, something flickered. A movement, a figure, perhaps, briefly outlined by the pale gleam of dawn's first light sneaking past the horizon. Your chest tightened again, the silent story unfolding just beyond the glass. That figure had not been there moments ago, or if it had been part shadow itself, shifting, watching, a silent observer waiting for the night to crack open. A sudden scrape sounded above, the wooden beams groaning under weight or age, or perhaps the secret shifts of something long hidden. You held your breath, caught between the cold grip of fear and the desperate hope that this was only the house settling, not a sign of darker truths. Your fingers found a crease in your threadbare nightclothes, catching a thread loose enough to pull. The harsh texture was a rude reminder of your predicament. No soft linens, no warmth to soothe 1,000 worries circling your mind. Back then, survival was a cruel lottery, played under the merciless governance of cold stone and shadow. You turned slowly, every creak of the floorboards echoing louder than it should. A reminder that here, silence was never just silence. It was a herald, a warning, a breath held too long. The candlelight wavered, then steadied, casting long fingers of amber across the uneven stones. In that hold, balanced on the edge of waking and dreaming, between safety and unknown, you saw it clearly. The manor was no longer merely a shelter. It was a watcher as much as it was watched. And somewhere beyond the frail glow of your candle, two eyes caught yours from the dark, sharp, glinting with quiet menace. The unsaid message hung heavier than the cold. The night was still young, but something had already begun to move inside the walls. Your breath hitched. The silent tapping resumed, now closer, sharper, as if tracing a pattern that only you were meant to hear. And in that shivering beat, you understood. The story was no longer just about surviving through the night, but facing what waited in its deepest shadows. The tapping pressed on, a relentless thread weaving into the suffocating quiet. Each sound felt magnified, bouncing off the cold stones and thick air like a signal from the deep. A message meant only for you. You shifted uneasily on the straw, its filaments scratching the skin barely guarded by your threadbare nightclothes. The room seemed to pulse with an energy you couldn't quite grip, an undercurrent pulling at the edges of your awareness. Outside, the fog thickened further, swallowing whole the manor's twisted shape until it became no more than a faded silhouette smudged against a gray canvas. The distant church bell tolled again, hollow and somber, marking time, as though reminding you that dawn was a promise still far away. You breathed in carefully, the scent of damp earth mixing briefly with faint whispers of peppermint, that fragile green defiance hanging precariously overhead. The door to your chamber creaked open once more, a cautious sound, carefully avoiding any hint of urgency. A shadow slipped in and dissolved immediately, leaving nothing but a cold draft that snuffed the candle's flame. Darkness lapped around your skin like a silent tide, revealing again how small and raw you felt in this vast, ancient house. Your eyes struggled to adjust, catching every subtle movement in the gloom. But no shape returned. No voice broke the spell. Just your own breath, echoing loudly enough to betray your presence. You pressed your back against the wall, leaning into the rough stone, cold and unyielding, but somehow grounding. There was a faint scuffling sound from the corridor, followed by a whispered dropped word, indecipherable but urgent. Your heart beat unevenly, like some wild animal trapped in a cage. Instinct told you this wasn't just a random disturbance. Something was brewing beneath the manor's quiet facade. You reached up and brushed your fingers lightly against the sprigs of peppermint, dangling just above your head. Their faint aroma was both balm and challenge, a reminder that somewhere life clings stubbornly, even in the shadow of decay and silence. The bittersweet scent seemed almost to pulse with your heartbeat, filling the empty corners of the chamber with fragile hope. Outside the window, the fog wavered, as if it too sensed the tension threading through the night. A faint outline reappeared, barely more than a ghost's whisper. Closer this time. Two eyes glinted from the mist, sharp stones catching the pale, hesitant light from the rising dawn. Their gaze fixed on you, unwavering and unreadable. You swallowed the tightening grip in your throat. This watcher was no stranger. The weight of unseen threats bore down like the cold stone beneath you. Every instinct screamed caution, every muscle tensed for flight or defense. But there was nowhere to run, only the shadows to hide in, and even those did not feel safe. A sudden sound broke the stillness, a low creak, unmistakably near, as if footsteps had found their rhythm along the upper hall. The wooden beams groaned under slow, deliberate pressure, a haunting melody of ancient wood bending to secrets too heavy to bear lightly. Your pulse quickened. The cold was now a sharp edge against your skin. The darkness no longer passive, but alive. Your hand found a loose thread on your sleeve, fingers pulling absent-mindedly. As your mind raced, no modern comforts here, no phones to call for help, no lights to banish shadows, no soft beds to heal a restless body. Just survival, thick and raw as the chill seeping in from the unfamiliar night. The tapping returned, slower now, calculated. A morse of the dark, a call to attention. You realized then the silence that had filled the manor was no mere absence of sound. It was a silence born of waiting, a fragile stillness before a storm's first growl. Your gaze locked with those eyes beyond the glass, the final barrier between your world and theirs. You saw questions hidden behind that look, warnings and promises wrapped tightly together, like a riddle you were only beginning to understand. Outside, the first pale brush of light teased the horizon, softening the edges of the fog until the manor's shape grew more solid once again. But inside, the shadows clung tighter than ever, reluctant to loosen their grip on the cold stones. You pressed your fingertips to the window's grime, a brief, fragile connection to the outside world that felt both distant and deeply immediate. The night was slipping away, but what it had brought in with it was far from gone. And then, as a breath held too long finally escaped, the door behind you creaked open just a fraction, slow and deliberate. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, motionless, listening. Your breath caught with a sudden cold surge. The chamber no longer just a room, but a stage set for secrets yet to unfold. Outside, the tapping ceased, but the waiting, oh, the waiting, had only just begun. The figure in the doorway remained still, a shadow etched sharply against the dim glow of the corridor beyond. Your breath caught, the frozen air suddenly thick enough to taste. The night had folded into its quietest fold yet, and here you were, alone, but no longer truly solitary. For a moment you resisted the pull of panic, focusing instead on the rough stone pressing against your back. It was a cold comfort, but an anchor to the tangible world when every other sense screamed of the unseen. The candle, now reduced to a stub, fought a losing battle against the creeping dark, its flame flickering weakly, like a heartbeat barely audible in the silence. Outside, the manor's old bones seemed to listen with you. The tapping had stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so dense it pressed in from the walls, from the very air. The cold draft teased the threadbare fabric of your nightclothes, a whispering touch reminding you how vulnerable you truly were. Then the figure moved, slow, deliberate steps, silent as a ghost's sigh. It stopped just beyond the threshold, hands unseen, but weight felt, a tension like the string of a bow drawn tight, holding back some word, some act. You could feel the chill in your limbs deepen, not from the cold stone, but from anticipation, waiting. The room seemed to shrink, the stuffed peppermint hanging above your head, swaying. Slightly, as if disturbed by a breath that wasn't yours. A soft creak, wood bending, or maybe the settling of a long-forgotten secret, released from its binding. The figure whispered a single word. It was lost to the shadows, but your mind shaped it into something urgent, something carved from the same quiet fear that gnawed at your ribs. Behind the door, the corridor held its breath. Somewhere far off, a muffled cough, a reminder that life, fragile as it was, pulsed faintly outside this pocket of stillness. Your fingers grazed the window ledge, tracing the cold grime where frost threatened to settle like a delicate dusting of forgotten time. For a fleeting moment, the smeared glass seemed like a veil, separating your fragile world from the lurking unknown. Outside, the mist clung stubbornly, swallowing shapes whole, until only a shadow remained where two watchers had been before. Their eyes no longer pierced the fog, but the weight of their absence pressed heavier than their presence ever could. The candle gave a final shudder and died, plunging the room into a velvet darkness. Your heartbeat sped, each thump a drumbeat in the cavern of silence. You swallowed, the dry rasp stinging the silence in your throat. Then, a breath, a slow exhale that wasn't yours, close enough to stir the air by your skin. You tensed, every nerve alive to the possibility that the night had taken a step inside, wearing the shape of shadow and whisper. Fingers clenched, you felt the roughness of straw beneath your hand, its bite grounding you. The peppermint scent lingered faintly, a fragile beacon in the gloom. You drew it in deep, willing it to fortify you against the dark's pressing weight. From somewhere above, the groan of wooden beams answered, a resonant echo that spoke of age, of endurance. The manor itself seemed to sigh, a tired giant rousing uneasily from slumber, wary of unknown threats. And then, a soft scrape just outside the door. A deliberate sound, too careful to be accidental. The figure was there again, testing boundaries, weaving closer into your fragile bubble of safety. In the husbandry of silence that followed, the space between heartbeat and breath stretched thin, taut like the tense string of a lute, ready to snap, but holding a melody no one could hear but you. Your gaze flicked upward past the narrow window pane, the first pale finger of dawn brushing the horizon. The manor's silhouette was retreating from the night, but you sensed not a retreat of danger, only a shift. A presence hovered, just at the edge of the dimming veil, the shadow unresolved, waiting for night's last secrets to peel away. Within the chamber, the whispered promise of safety was fragile, nothing more than a breath easily snatched away by unseen hands. You tightened your grip on the rough fabric of your clothes, heart hammering an urgent beat beneath ribs sharpened by cold and fear. Outside, beyond the glass, two eyes glinted faintly once more, sharp, accusing, watching, before disappearing into the still unfolding light. And just as your mind dared to chase questions into the dawn, the door behind you shifted again, a movement so slight it might have been imagined. But this time, the shadow lingered longer. A whisper echoed, and the first word you thought you heard was your name. The shadow in the doorway hesitated, a thin line between presence and absence. Your breath caught, the air suddenly thicker, colder, as if the room itself had drawn a silent shroud tighter around your shoulders. The faint scent of peppermint, a stubborn green flicker against the creeping dampness, seemed to pulse with quiet defiance in the dark. The figure's steps resumed, slow, deliberate, each footfall a soft murmur against the cold stone floor. They moved just far enough to suggest caution, but not retreat, an intimate dance of shadow and suspicion. For a moment, your senses froze, suspended in the tight space between dread and curiosity. Outside, the fog thickened, smudging edges, swallowing shapes whole. The manor's ancient bones sighed, a quiet, mournful groan that rolled through rafters and walls alike. Somewhere distant, a church bell tolled again, hollow and deliberate, marking the slow march of time. Inside, your heartbeat answered with a quickened rhythm, a fragile drum within brittle ribs. Your fingers brushed the roughened straw beneath you, its bite grounding you to the present, while the unseen world wavered at the edge of sight. The threadbare linen of your clothes, grazed skin, chilled by cold stone and shadow. Here, the past was a breath rising from dust, a pulse beneath the surface. The figure stepped back toward the doorway, but lingered there, a silent question hanging in the gloom. Then, in an almost breathless moment, a whisper broke free. Your name, not spoken exactly, but shaped from the thick air, like a secret carried on a sigh. It melted away just as quickly, leaving only the echo of its intent. Outside the window, shadows shifted, two watchers emerging from fog, with the faint gleam of early dawn catching in their eyes once more. Their faces remained hidden, framed by the murmur of mist, but their gaze was sharp, a silent vow. You pulled your knees closer, the straw flaring sharp against skin already numb with cold. The warmth from the dying fire had vanished hours ago, leaving behind a fragile heat that flickered in memory more than reality. The stones pressed against your back like a confession written in cold. The night was no longer your shelter, but your judge. A soft scraping sound echoed above, the groan of old wood under secrets too heavy to stay buried. Your breath slowed, your body tightening with awareness. The chamber seemed to shrink, the dark folding in tight, an endless room with walls that whispered. The peppermint swayed gently, its promise of protection as delicate as a sigh, standing defiant beneath the weight of centuries. Then the door creaked with a measure of inevitability. The figure, closer now, returned to the threshold, silent, watching, waiting. The candle stub flickered once more, casting long fingers of honeyed light that clawed at the shadows. Your eyes locked with the darkness beyond, seeking meaning in the stillness. A breath brushed your skin, so soft it might have been the night itself exhaling. But your body tensed into readiness. No ordinary visitor would dare such calculated subtlety. Every fiber of your being throbbed with the knowledge that something unseen was settling into the bones of the manor, threading into its endless night. The figure spoke again, voice low, more a vibration than speech, a drawl of words tangled in shadow. You caught only fragments, promises unkept, warnings given too late. A name whispered between the walls, a forgotten story clawing back into light. Outside the window, the first pale light peeled back the curtain of fog. What had been vague shapes now sharpened, an army of silhouettes, frozen in a dawn that felt heavier, darker. The watcher's eyes sparked, flint against smoke, before vanishing as the mist claimed them once more. The room grew colder still. Or perhaps the cold had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. Your gaze drifted upward, catching the flutter of the peppermint's leaves, a stubborn green heart beating faintly in the gloom. You breathed deeply, trying to anchor yourself with its bitter sweetness. Life, fragile and fierce, clinging to the edges of decay. Then, a distant footstep beyond the chamber, careful and slow, tracing the passage like a thread in a vast tapestry. The wooden beams moaned, a low, sorrowful song that echoed down empty halls. The manor itself seemed to stretch thin between past and present, a living skeleton exhaling cold secrets. You shifted slightly, the coarse straw sliding beneath your skin, a reminder of your vulnerability. With no shield but threadbare linen and whispered prayers, every breath felt heavier. A quiet struggle, not just against cold, but against the invisible tide gathering beyond the walls. Suddenly, a movement in the darkness, a faint silhouette stepping just inside the candle's reach. The figure tilted its head, eyes glinting like shards of obsidian in the fading light. Your heart thundered, a wild, urgent beat in the delicate stillness. The room seemed to hold its breath, time folding back on itself with the slow insistence of a tide pulling at unseen shores. You knew then that the manor and the night itself had shaped a crucible for what was to come. The candle fluttered once more, then steadied, throwing shadows in sharp relief. In that precarious glow, you saw the silent promise. This night would not end with dawn. And just as your fingers brushed the peppermint once again, steadying your trembling hands, the figure whispered one last time, this time clear and piercing, a word that shattered the quiet. Your name. The door creaked closed behind them, the final note in a symphony of silence, now filled with unsaid threats and waiting shadows. Outside, the manor exhaled, long and low, its ancient breath carrying a promise you could no longer ignore. The story was far from over, and whatever came next was already stepping through the darkness. The shadow in the doorway held still a moment longer, as if wrestling with the weight of what it might say next. Your breath was a shallow ripple in the thick quiet, the room's stale air pressing down with the cold certainty of forgotten winters. The peppermint sprigs, now a fragile guard above your head, trembled faintly, their faint scent stitching a thin thread of life into the gloom. With deliberate steps, the figure advanced, each footfall a muted protest against the cold stones beneath. The door creaked closed behind them, a ribbon of darkness sealing away what little warmth remained. Your fingers clenched the coarse straw mattress, grounding yourself against the silent tide gathering in the air. The chamber shrank, or perhaps you did, as tension folded the space tighter, like cloth pulled taut. Candle flame flickered weakly, shadows twisting and untwisting like whispered secrets. The faint scent of burned wood clung stubbornly, mingling with damp earth and that stubborn breath of peppermint. Then came the voice, low, almost a thread of sound, barely brushing the edges of hearing. It spoke your name, but not as a friend would call. More like a warning hissed through cracked lips by someone who has seen too much and hopes desperately for otherwise. Time stretched, every moment thick and slow. The candle's fight against the gathering dark seemed as fragile as your own heartbeat. You swallowed the dry rasp in your throat and tried to steady your shaking hands. Threadbare fabric scraped faintly against skin chilled through dense stone. Outside, the fog clung to the manor again, softening outlines. Until then, ancient walls seemed to dissolve into the gray nothing. Your sight flicked to the narrow window, where, for a heartbeat, two glowing eyes returned, sharp, intent, unreadable, before vanishing once more beneath the fog's silent shroud. That gaze felt like a loose thread tugged tight around your chest. Something waited beyond that veil, patient, watchful, unwilling to be ignored. A faint shuffle echoed in the corridor. Old beams groaned overhead, sighs of wood burdened with secrets long buried. Every sound was amplified, a chorus accompanying the slow unraveling of the night's fragile veil. The figure shifted nearer, just enough to be present, not enough to break the spell. A jaw clenched beneath shadow, a breath drawn quietly in expectation. In the distance, the hollow toll of a church bell pealed through the fog, a morning call sliced thin by icy dawn. The manor's stone bones seemed to shudder in reply, shivering with memories that never quite rest. Your eyes drifted downward, catching the delicate sway of peppermint leaves above. Their scent, faint but stubborn, wove a slender promise, life stubborn in decay. A throbbing murmur pressed at the edges of your hearing, footsteps, slow and deliberate, curling like smoke through empty halls. The walls remembered these sounds, folded them in like worn pages of an old, dark book. You shifted on the scratchy straw, the roughness biting through your thin clothes as frost bit at your skin. Survival here was a constant balancing act between cold and warmth, silence and sound, hope and fear. And then, impossibly close now, the figure's silhouette stepped further inside the fading glow of the candle stub. Sharp eyes met yours across the shrinking room, hard, cold, as if guarding something too dangerous to speak aloud. Your heart hammered a wild rhythm, a frantic drummer in the slow dance of shadows. The air tasted of damp stone and the faint, bitter edge of smoldering wood. The faint candlelight threw long fingers that reached and recoiled as if the room itself were breathing shallowly, caught between breath and silence. The figure's voice came again, clearer this time, a rough whisper, barely more than a scratch against the thick air. The words were strange, tangled in shadow. Promises broken, warnings too late, names whispered like incantations. Your mind raced to catch the fragments, but the full meaning hid just beyond reach, like a half-remembered dream slipping into dawn. Outside, the first pale fingers of dawn crept slowly, tentative, peeling back the heavy cobweb of fog. The manor's silhouette sharpened in the weak light. But inside, the darkness clung faster than the day could wash it away. Your fingers found the peppermint again, clutching the tiny green leaves, a futile anchor in a night suddenly feral with secrets. And then, the shift, a subtle change in the heavy, waiting air. The candle blossomed once more, fighting the dark with a weak, steady glow. Eyes locked again. This time, the figure's glare was a blade, sharp and certain. The whispered promise spun into a final word, clear and cruel. In its simplicity, your name. The chamber held its breath as the figure stepped back, and just as the cold grip of night seemed ready to close completely, the door creaked once more. Slowly, almost reluctantly, it swung wider. Beyond stood not one shadow, but many. Ghosts of dawn silhouetted against the faint light, their shapes twisting between mist and stone. And through the silence, the quiet tapping returned. This time 3 sharp knocks, deliberate, rhythmic. A new message, a new move in a game you could barely begin to understand. And as the dawn bled pale gold along the horizon, the manor's secrets stretched and shifted, weaving shadows no longer content to stay silent. You were no longer waiting for the night, for danger, or even for survival. You were waiting for what came next. The figure's silhouette lingered in the doorway, reluctant to break the suffocating quiet that had swallowed the chamber whole. Your breath stalled, a fragile thread suspended in the thick, expectant air. The faint, stubborn scent of peppermint wove through the gloom, an almost tangible defiance against the encroaching cold and shadow. It was as if the room itself bent toward that presence, shrinking into itself, the very stones tightening like a noose. The candle's feeble flame flickered uncertainly, casting jittering slivers of amber light that recoiled from the advancing dark. Every creak in the timbered rafters above felt like a slow, deliberate pulse, the manor's weary bones awakening in the dead of night. Your fingers curled tighter around the rough straw mattress beneath you. Its sharp fibers bit into your raw skin, tethering you to this grim reality. The threadbare linen failing to shield you from draft and dread. You are starkly alone in this hour, albeit a company of shadows and whispers surrounded you. The figure shifted, stepping forward on hesitant feet that barely disturbed the silence. As they crossed the threshold, their eyes caught yours. Sharp, unreadable, heavy with unspoken tales. The candlelight caught flecks of something steely in their gaze, while the rest remained securely cloaked by the dense darkness. A quiet authority hung in their posture, as if they carried the weight of the manor's secrets pressed firmly into their bones. A breathless pause stretched between you, and then, from their lips, a voice, barely. Above a murmur rose a rasping thread of sound that tangled with the damp air. It was your name, spoken not as a greeting, but as a summons, wrapped in tones of warning and inevitable consequence. The sound was nearly swallowed by the thick stone walls, but its weight pressed upon your chest like the first heavy drops before a storm. You swallowed against the dry scrape of your throat, heart sparking wild rhythms that echoed through the hollow chamber. Outside, the fog clung, thicker still, muting the world into a grayed blur, where even the stars seemed to shrink behind veils of mist. Your eyes darted to the narrow window, where for a single heartbeat, two faint pairs of eyes glinted like smoldering coals caught in the gray haze, watchful, patient, almost knowing. Then, as if satisfied, they vanished behind the fog's enveloping shroud, leaving you gripped by a shiver far beyond cold. The peppermint overhead stirred gently, as though a breath unseen had passed by, an ethereal reminder of persistence, life clawing its way even through rot and shadow. You brushed your fingers softly over the fragile leaves, seeking a momentary calm in their bitter green scent. The only other sound was the slow, tense creak of timber settling, or was it footsteps above? The old beams groaned in protest under invisible weight, a whispered symphony of age-old secrets pressing down. Something roamed beyond the chamber walls, slipping closer with deliberate intent. Your gaze flicked to the door again, just as a shadow moved against the fading candlelight, a silhouette larger than before, inches closer, but still holding back. The air thickened, every fiber of your skin tingling with raw anticipation. Words followed, whispered again with cracked urgency. You caught fragments, warnings shattered, promises broken, names taken by time. Their meaning hovered on the edge of understanding, like a half-remembered nightmare dissolving as dawn approached. Outside, light shyly reached across the horizon, peeling away the thick curtain of night, but failing to dissolve the shadows clinging inside. The manor seemed caught in between worlds, darkness unwilling to fully release its hold, and day only partially born. Your hands found the peppermint again, clutching the tiny leaves close. In this fragile green defiance, you grasped for strength, for a thread of hope. Amid the suffocating cold, then came a subtle shift. The candle's flame steadied, holding its place against the thick gathering gloom. The figure's eyes locked on yours once more, hard and unyielding, casting an unspoken challenge across the narrow room. They leaned in just enough for their voice to scrape against your skin. This time, the word landed sharp and clear. Your name. Every breath held in the chamber trembled, hanging heavy with meaning, yet unspoken. The figure withdrew slowly, stepping back toward the door, while the silence seemed to deepen, swallowing the space left behind. But the stillness did not last. The door creaked, once slow and measured, as if pulled by an unseen hand. It swung open wider, and through the widening gap fell a flood of new shadows. Not one figure, but many. Shapes assembling at the edge of the dim hall, their forms flickering between stone and mist. They moved with deadly quiet grace, like ghosts summoned by the first hesitant light. And from somewhere within that gathering, the tapping resumed. 3 sharp, precise knocks that cut through the silence like a code forged in darkness. Your heartbeat quickened in terrified rhythm, pulse thudding against ribs that now felt far too fragile. The manor exhaled again, ancient and knowing, its centuries-old breath carrying secrets eager to uncoil and weave anew. You were no longer merely a witness to the night's unfolding tale. You were caught within its web, waiting for the next breath, the next move. And whatever it might be, it was already stepping through the shadows. The door creaked open once more, slower now, less a threat and more an invitation diluted in silence. The candle's last flicker steadied, casting a faint amber glow that seemed to settle softly upon the cold stone floor. A quiet sigh of endurance after hours weighed down by shadow and waiting. You pressed back against the wall, feeling the texture of rough mortar beneath your skin, grounding you in the here and now. The fragile green of the peppermint sprigs overhead stirred gently, as if breathing with relief, their bittersweet scent weaving a final note of life into the chamber's ancient stillness. The figure in the doorway stepped fully into the dim light, no longer a specter, but a bearer of quiet resolve. Their eyes met yours, no longer shrouded in menace, but softened by an unspoken understanding. The room, once tight with tension, now seemed to breathe alongside you, as if the stone walls themselves exhaled a long-held breath. In that moment, the whispered name that had pierced the dark hours lost its edge, becoming instead a solemn call towards something beyond fear. The figure's lips moved again, this time delivering words clear and calm, voices that carried the weight of heavy truths at last laid bare. You learned then what the silent watchers had guarded for centuries, stories folded into the manor's bones, echoes of choices and sacrifices woven into the fabric of its walls. The promise, once hidden beneath layers of mistrust and shadow, unfolded gently now, revealing relief, reconciliation, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Outside, the fog thinned slow and soft, brushing away the night's oppressive mantle. The manor's silhouette sharpened against the dawn, no longer a fortress of dread, but a sanctuary worn by time and tempered by memory. The distant church bell tolled once more, its mournful call now softened into a peaceful murmur, carried lightly on the cool morning breeze. The chamber's small warmth returned quietly, not from the hearth, but from the fragile peace settling in your chest. The rough straw beneath you no longer bit harshly, but cradled as one might a secret, carefully kept, then finally freed. Even the threadbare linen, failing to shield from the cold before, now felt less a burden and more a reminder of resilience. Your fingers brushed the peppermint again, inhaling its faint brightness, a gentle act of defiance against the long shadow of the past. The scent wrapped around you, soft as a lullaby whispered to the dawn, coaxing your racing heart towards stillness and peace. The footsteps outside, once ominous and deliberate, now faded into the gentle rhythm of a waking world. The unseen watchers, those glinting eyes in the fog, had receded, not with menace, but as guardians stepping back into the folds of history. Their vigilance softened, leaving space for rest. You leaned your head back against the uneven stone, the chill retreating like the night itself, swallowed by the first warmth of day. The manor's breath, long held captive in shadow, now flowed steady and slow, rhythmic as your own. That quiet tapping that had threaded through the long, dark hours was no longer a warning, but the gentle pulse of a story reaching its close. It echoed softly, a fragile heartbeat wrapped in the stillness that follows storms. Your thoughts began to drift, weighted with the calm after much unrest. The tense lines of worry softened, replaced by a tender quiet, the kind that wraps you close, like a well-worn cloak on the coolest mornings. Outside, the pale sun stretched fingers across hills and fields long unseen in the night's clutch. Birds stirred, their songs slow and uncertain, but full of promise, filling the empty spaces with the slow return of life. The manor, a silent sentinel for centuries, stood. Quiet, yet dignified, a witness to endings and beginnings alike. Its stones, cold and worn, seemed touched by something softer, a final benediction whispered into their enduring bones. As you stretched your hand again toward the peppermint, this time you did so without urgency or fear. Just a simple gesture that carried the weight of survival and the grace of release. Your breath deepened, slow and steady, flowing out like the fading night, emptying the chambers of tension and filling them with a peace both fragile and unbreakable. With the dawn's light now spilling fully through the window, the room transformed as if it too had found rest. The shadows folded gently away, no longer looming, but settling softly into quiet corners where they belonged. You closed your eyes for a moment, feeling the last trace of cold seep out of your body, replaced by a warmth born not of fire, but of closure. The night's long story had been told, not with loud conquests or sudden revelations, but with the slow, steady unraveling of fear and the quiet, steadfast claim of hope. In that perfect stillness, just before the world fully woke, a serene exhaustion wrapped around you like a tender shroud. The peppermint scent drifted faintly, a whisper of life, a promise sealed in green. And as your breath slowed, steady and deep, the manor's ancient secret settled once and for all, folding you gently into its long night's quiet end, and the peace of a new morning waiting quietly beyond the stone walls.